Have you ever had a dream that just totally shattered? I know what it feels like to stand in the wreckage of a dream that I thought would last forever. I mean, there was a moment in my life when I truly believed that I was on the path that God had carved out for me. I mean, I prayed over it. I had prepared for it. I had poured my heart and energy into it. It wasn't just a plan. I mean, it was a vision that I thought was from God. And then almost overnight, it all unraveled. I remember realizing that it was slipping away. I mean, this sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, the kind of heaviness that just makes it hard to breathe, let alone to think clearly. I mean, I kept telling myself, this can't be happening. Not after all that I've invested, not after everything that I believed that God had promised in my life. And quite frankly, when it was over, I felt embarrassed. I even felt ashamed. I also felt confused. I told people that this is what God was calling me to do. I mean, I had staked my reputation, my time, my trust on it. And when it all fell apart, I didn't know what to say anymore. I didn't even know what to pray. I just felt blindsided. I didn't know whether I had failed or whether God had just decided to close a door that I didn't see coming. And to be honest, part of me even wondered if I had heard him correctly in the first place. I mean, that's what failure does. Failure makes you question your hearing. It makes you question your calling. It even makes you question your worth. I replayed it over and over for several years, actually. Replayed it over and over again. The decisions that I had made, the things that I could have done differently. You know, the what ifs, the why nows. I tried to make sense of it all. But the silence on the other side of my prayers was deafening. I mean, what do you do when the very thing that you were certain of falls apart? I mean, we've all stood in that place where expectations didn't match reality, and it left us unsure of what's next. I mean, maybe for you, it was a job that you gave everything to. I mean, the one that you built your schedule around, the one that gave you your lifestyle, and the one that your identity is all wrapped up in. And then without warning, it was gone. I mean, you were called into the office and handed a folder, or maybe you were just left out of the next round of meetings, and suddenly everything you worked for was gone in a single conversation. And now you're left wondering, how did this happen? And what does this say about me? Or maybe it was a relationship in your life that has failed. I mean, you prayed about that relationship. You committed to that relationship. You made sacrifices for that relationship. You were convinced that this was part of your future. But then one day it wasn't. I mean, the text stopped. The tone changed. The love faded. And now you're sitting alone with questions that just have no answers. And you're asking yourself if you misread everything. I mean, if you even gave too much to the relationship, if you missed some sign that could have prevented the pain. And for some of us, it's our role as a parent. I mean, you tried to do everything right. You poured your life into that child. You poured your values into that child. You poured your prayers into that child. And most of all, you poured your time into that child. I mean, you did your best to lead them well. And yet, they're drifting. Or maybe they're already gone. And now every decision they make, the ones that break your heart, every decision they make that breaks your heart feels like a quiet whisper that just echoes in your mind, and it says, you failed. Maybe your failure isn't public. Maybe it was private. Maybe it was a moment, a decision, a bad habit that cost you more than you could have ever imagined. I mean, you thought that it would stay hidden, but now it's come to light in front of everybody, and you just feel exposed and embarrassed and maybe even disqualified. And the worst part is, you don't just carry the weight of what you did. You carry the fear that God just might be done with you. Or maybe you believe that you were following God's will. I mean, you stepped out by faith. You prayed. You trusted. You told people that this is God's will. And when it all fell apart, you didn't just lose the dream. You lost confidence in your ability to even hear God. And now you're grieving the loss. And you're questioning your calling. You're questioning your discernment. You're maybe even questioning your worth. And here's what makes it worse. Failure doesn't whisper. It echoes. It replays in your head when you're trying to sleep. It shows up in conversations when no one even knows that you're thinking about it. It hides in the silence of your prayers, and it sits heavy in the moments when you should feel peace. And the haunting question underneath all of it is, did I fail? Am I a failure? Now, the good news is that the Bible reminds us that God brings purpose out of pain and redemption out of what seems ruined. And so the big idea that I really want you to grab a hold of today, write this down in your notes. The big idea that I want you to grab a hold of today is this, that God can turn your loss into His legacy. God can turn your loss into His legacy. You see, what seems like a dead end is really just a divine detour. So it's not over when you feel like it's over. And we're going to look today in our narrative, we're going to look at the story of Ruth. And this story of Ruth begins with a broken road. But God is already prepared to give Ruth a better destination. And we pick up this story of Ruth in Ruth chapter 1, where we are introduced to this family that is facing a devastating loss. Elimelech and his wife, Naomi, and their two sons, they left Bethlehem in Israel. They left Bethlehem, God's promised land, and they moved outside of it to a place called Moab. Now, it might have looked like a practical decision for them. I mean, after all, there was famine in the land of Israel, so they just went where there was food. But what followed was heartbreak. Let's look in our narrative in Ruth chapter 1, verses 3 and 5. Ruth 1, verses 3 and 5 says this, and Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her two sons. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them. And the woman was left of her two sons and her husband. So Naomi, her husband Elimelech, and her two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, moved out of Bethlehem, went to Moab where there was food, and somewhere in that process, Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion died. And Naomi was left with two daughter-in-laws. Now, Naomi's story begins with famine. there in Israel. She moves to 3 funerals, and ultimately, she feels like a failure. She left full from Bethlehem, and now she is going to return to Bethlehem empty. I mean, she says it herself. Look down in verse number 21 in your notes. Look at Ruth chapter 1, verse 21 in your notes. The Bible says, this is Ruth saying this. She says, I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Now let's pause here for just a moment. What Naomi doesn't yet realize is that her emptiness is the very soil where God is about to plant something new. You see, God's plan can begin where yours ends. That's a very important principle that you and I need to understand, that God's plan can begin where yours ends. Now, Naomi couldn't see it, but the story of redemption was already unfolding through the very person that was walking by her side. And that person's name was Ruth. You see, Naomi's 2 sons had married while they're in Moab. And one of Naomi's daughter-in-laws, when her husband died, well, she decided to go off back into Moab and probably married another Moabite. But Ruth, that's not what she did. Ruth wanted to stay right by Naomi's side as Naomi traveled back to Bethlehem. Look at it in verse 6. Look in your notes. Ruth chapter 1, verse 6, where the Bible says this. And Ruth said, entreat me not to leave thee, for whither thou goest, I will go. So Ruth is just saying, I'm going to stick with you. Look, you're going to go back to Bethlehem, I'm going to Bethlehem with you. If you're going to stay here in Moab, I'm going to stay right here. We're going to live out our lives together. Now, Ruth's loyalty wasn't just a beautiful gesture. It was the bridge that God used to bring restoration. I mean, out of the ashes of Naomi's loss, God was positioning Ruth to become part of the lineage of King David, and ultimately part of the legacy of Jesus. I mean, think about it. Out of failure becomes the framework for salvation. Listen, don't ever forget that God is present in the bitter and the broken. I mean, just because you see everything as failure and you feel broken from that failure and bitterness because you failed, does not mean that God is absent. God may seem distant. He may seem gone even. But the thought that God is not there is a myth. God is present in the bitter and the broken. Now, Naomi was honest. I mean, she didn't fake her feelings here. And so she renamed herself. Look in your notes at Ruth chapter 1 and verse 20. Look at what Ruth says. Look at what Naomi says. Call me not Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty hath dealt bitterly with me. Now, Naomi's name means pleasant. But Mara, the one that she wants to be called now, means bitter. Now, she wasn't just grieving. She was identifying with her grief. But here's the key. Even in her bitterness, God was already working. Even in her honesty, He was not absent. The book of Ruth never says that God rebuked Naomi for her bitterness. It just keeps showing how God stayed faithful in her bitterness. God's always there. I mean, what a powerful reminder that God doesn't wait for you to be okay before He starts working. And we need to constantly be reminded that God's silence is not God's absence. God's silence is not God's absence. We often think that God is nowhere around when we can't hear Him. and we can't hear what he's saying. But so we mistakenly assume that God is not there. But the truth is that God is always there. We have just believed a myth that if God is silent, then God must be absent. And just because God is silent does not mean he is absent. Now, this chapter ends in a very quiet and almost subtle way. Let's look at verse number 22 in your notes. Ruth chapter 1, verse 22 says this. Say, Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law with her. And they came to Bethlehem. Now, this is key. Underline this next part in your notes. They came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest. Now, this is more than a timestamp. It's a turning point. The famine is over. The harvest is beginning. I mean, everything that Naomi left for, she is coming back to gain. Naomi thinks that she's returning home to nothing. But she's actually arriving at the exact moment where God's provision is about to appear into her life. Now, here's what that means for you and me. God can work through our worst chapter to write his best story. What Naomi saw as failure, God saw as a foundation. What Naomi saw as a loss, God was launching a legacy. And what Naomi saw as an ending, God was just getting started. So, when your story feels like a setback, God is still writing a comeback. So I want to challenge you. If you're standing in the ruins of something that you thought that God was going to do in your life, that God was going to bless, don't give up. The harvest doesn't come right after the heartbreak, but I want to encourage you, it does come. God specializes in turning what is broken into blessing. I mean, don't let shattered dreams shape your future. Let God's redemption rewrite your story. Now, maybe for you, the dream broke slowly. I mean, a plan just slowly unraveled. A hope just slowly faded away. A prayer it just seemed always unanswered. Or maybe it shattered in an instant. An unexpected loss, a painful decision, a door that slammed shut that you were expecting to always stay open, and now you're standing in the quiet aftermath wondering, where is God in this? I mean, if anything, what if anything is left? Where is it? I mean, you tried to follow his lead, right? You prayed for it. You planned for it. You trusted God for it. But now everything has fallen apart, and you find yourself asking, did I get it wrong? Did I miss God's will? And did I fail God? And beneath all of this grief, beneath all of this heartache, beneath all of this pain, you say things like, if I couldn't hold this together, maybe I'm the one who's broken. But what if, like Naomi, what if your emptiness isn't the end of your story? I mean, what if it's actually the beginning of something only God can write? I mean, you might not see the harvest yet. You might still be walking on the road to Bethlehem like Naomi and Ruth were, pondering what just happened. But I want to remind you that you're not walking alone. You're not walking unseen. So what does it look like to let God redeem your brokenness? I mean, maybe for you, Maybe it means letting go of the shame that you've been carrying and telling someone the truth about where you're struggling. I mean, maybe it's choosing to pray again, not because you feel strong, but because you're finally ready to let God meet you in your weakness. Maybe for you, it's giving yourself permission to grieve the loss without believing the lie that your future is over. I mean, could you try that this week? I mean, just one prayer, just one act of trust, just one step toward hope. Because God doesn't need your story to be put together. No, He just needs it to be surrendered. And when you do that, something begins to shift in your life. I mean, His grace starts filling the gaps. His presence shows up in the bitterness. And what once felt like failure becomes the very soil where legacy begins to grow. So before you move on, ask yourself this question. Am I letting my failure define my future? Or will I let God redeem my story? Let God write that next chapter. You see, failure isn't the end of your story, but the pathway to something greater. What would happen if we stopped seeing failure as the period at the end of our story and start seeing it as the comma at the beginning of God's sentence? I mean, imagine the kind of church that we would become if instead of hiding in our failures and in our shame, we brought them into light, believing that our God is still at work in the dark. I mean, what if we stopped running from the pain of our past and started believing that it is the very soil where God wants to grow something new? Could we become a community where no one feels disqualified by their disappointments? Could we become a church where the person who thought they had nothing left discovers that God is just getting started? Could we become a church where those who walked in empty began to believe that harvest is still possible, not because everything is perfect, but because even in silence, God is planning something redemptive? I mean, what if we really believe that our worst moments don't cancel out our calling, but position us for deeper dependence on the one who never left us? And what if every broken dream became a doorway to deeper trust? What if we stopped replaying the what ifs in our lives and in our past and began rehearsing the promises of God for our future? I mean, can you imagine what it would feel like to sit with someone in their lowest moment, not to fix them, but just to remind them that God is not done. This is not the end. That God does His best work in the aftermath of what looks like failure. And that the cross looked like a loss until resurrection rewrote the story. We could become people who carry hope into hard places, who walk with each other through unanswered questions and unhealed wounds, believing that redemption might just be one chapter away. I mean, we could become a community that doesn't just speak of God's grace, but lives it, breathes it, and gives it freely to those who are still bleeding from their own detours and disappointments. Because we know what's true. We know that God can turn your loss into His legacy. And we believe that when we live like that our church becomes more than a gathering. It becomes a glimpse of what redemption looks like in real time. We become a family of the once broken, now being rebuilt. We become the kind of place where empty hands are never the end, but always the beginning. So I want to challenge you to take a next step. Would you be willing this week to set aside 5 minutes each day to pray and let God meet you in your weakness? If you are, I'm going to challenge you to check the box on your connection card and let me know that. Would you be willing this week to journal just one thing that you've lost that still weighs on your heart, and then ask God to begin rewriting your story through it? If you're willing to do that, check that box on your connection card. Would you be willing to take time this week to reflect and write down one situation in your past where God brought good out of something hard? And then be sure to thank Him for it. And then finally, would you be willing to encourage someone who may be feeling like a failure by sending them a text message, or simply take them out for a cup of coffee and just remind them that God is not done? If you're willing to do that, would you check the box on your connection card and let me know? Our music team is going to come sing for us. And as they sing, you go ahead and finish completing that connection card.